Hi guys, I wanted to share a few tips with you about the skill of contextualization. I realize and recognize from one of the recent assignments that I do need to go over this more. And as we have an essay coming up later this coming week, wanted to make sure you had what you needed to know to do a good job on contextualization. It's basically the setting for something, although it's more complex than that. I just want to point out in this slide that you need contextualization for everything: an event, an era, a question or prompt, a document, broader development, all of those things. And we'll look at one or two examples. The key about contextualization, or at the very bottom of it, is trying to see the bigger picture of an event or something that happened in history. So you know the saying, you can see the trees but not the forest. For contextualization, you need to be able to see the forest, and if you focus too much on the event without stepping back and seeing what led to it or what effects it had, then it's going to be difficult to get a real grasp on history, American history in particular. Contextualizing means both identifying, that's the easy part, and explaining, the harder part, but we're going to go through that. It means identifying and explaining events related to whatever historical example you are considering, and you must explain the connection. So for contextualization, generally speaking, it can be something in the past, present, or the future of whatever historical event you are considering. I will give you more tips on that in a moment, which is best to use for right now. It might be useful to use some kind of graphic organizer. I always like to just draw a circle and put a word in or an event, and then see what I come up with that's related to it, and I put that in the outer circle, obviously. I'll show you an example of in this case, the battles of Lexington and Concord, which took place outside of Boston in April 1775. A year before the Declaration of Independence. But let's look. This is what I knew about those battles when I tried to think of things that were related to them. And generally speaking, it is easiest to do things that happen in the past and that led to whatever event or era or whatever you are looking at. So in this case, you can see for yourself, these were all things that I considered for this particular event. I knew they all had something to do with the battles of Lexington and Concord, and they were within the 25-year suggested limit. So let me explain these general rules, and I think they will help you with contextualization. From everything I've ever read, students usually have most success with contextualization before the event. It's more difficult to do present and can be more difficult to do future as well. The present tends to be the hardest. It can get confusing and then maybe has more to do with the topic than with the actual contextualization. So I always suggest students start out with contextualizing before the event. Rule number 2, don't go more than 25 years in the past or future. Very few exceptions to that. You don't want to have to, you wouldn't want to have to read a lot of essays I had to read at the APUS reading several years ago when the DBQ question was about women's rights in the 1900s, after the World War II through 1980, I think it was. You wouldn't believe how many people their contextualization began since the time of Adam and Eve, or since the first people. That's going way too far back. You know what that says? You don't know anything particular in the 20 years before that could apply to that topic. That's really all that shows. So avoid that at all costs. And so for explaining contextualization, you will need at least two, preferably three concrete events that do connect to each other and to the historical event. And I note here, usually explaining contextualization for a historical event will involve causation. And I think you'll see with the two examples I'm going to give you that that is in fact true. Just something to note, nothing you have to memorize, it'll happen automatically. So for the battles of Lexington and Concord, I'll read through it. If you could read along as you're watching this, and I have highlighted the three concrete or specific historical events I used to come up with this contextualization. There's nothing here that any of you could not have done. Absolutely everybody could have done this. Tensions had been building in and around Boston across a 10-year period of political protests by the colonists in the area. The British government issued the Intolerable Acts in 1774, which severely restricted colonial freedoms in Massachusetts. Thousands of British troops were sent to that colony to quell discontent. However, colonists pledged to form their own government and disobey any and all British commands through the issue of the Suffolk Resolves, which included a call for all colonies to raise their own militias, as Townsend, Massachusetts had already done. With British troops in Boston and the colonial militia setting up outside the town, battles were sure to break out, and Lexington and Concord became the first two of the Revolutionary War. The thing about contextualization to remember, there's not one right way. The only right thing is to be substantive and follow these general rules. You can be wrong as far as, well, that's not good contextualization, or you really didn't connect those things, or what does that have to do with Lexington and Concord? Those are all correct things for me as a teacher to tell you. But if you use different events and you have a completely different contextualization that absolutely works, that is fine. That's always fine. That's understood. So this was the example I was talking about. You contextualize also an essay question or essay prompt, same thing, right? It means the same thing. And if you recall, the first introductory paragraph of an essay will include your contextualization leading to your thesis. So it's very important that your contextualization relates directly to the prompt. So we're going to use that example that you guys, some of you are still working on. That's fine. Obviously, you're not going to use the same contextualization. And the question was this: to what extent was the U.S. Constitution a radical departure from the Articles of Confederation? Recalling the three general rules, we will, 1, consider related events before the Constitution, not go beyond 25 years in the past, and 3, we'll find 3 events to relate to the prompt and to each other, of course, because the paragraph has to make sense, right? See if you can tell why I say focusing on events before the articles would not work for this question. See if you can tell why not. You can always go back to that one and take a look at it. So you don't need a graphic organizer. You can, but I like to see things spatially. So I just threw out some things I was thinking of that were related, that happened really in between the U.S. Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. There would be no need to go way back to colonial times for this, or talk about any colonial discontent, only if you're talking about the reasons for the articles being the way they were, right over here. Reasons for the articles being the way they were. Whoops. And then you might want to bring up something. But as you can see, all of these happen in between. Well, state constitutions happened right after the basically the Declaration of Independence. States rewrite from colonial, they become state constitutions, and they're rewritten. But because the question is what it is, we really don't want to go much farther back than that. And it's because we're going to explain that, yeah, there were differences between these things, these documents. Of course, there were continuities as well, although those were less obvious. Just looking at contextualization, and this is the last slide. And let me read through it. I've also again highlighted it, I've bolded, excuse me, the words that are specific evidence. And you always do need, you can't be vague and overgeneral. You have to put stuff in that's concrete evidence. Okay. That a reader, when looking at it, could say to him or herself, this student knows something, knows what they're talking about here. So that's how concrete it has to be. The Articles of Confederation were written with the intention of only permitting a weak central government due to fears of a repeat of British monarchy and tyranny. But they gave the government so little power that it became exceedingly difficult for Washington to prosecute the war, to run the war for independence. His soldiers froze and starved at Valley Forge for lack of clothing, food, and other resources that the states were supposed to have provided, but were not forced to because the new government could not levy taxes. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts revealed the government's total inability to deal with disorders. So in 1787, delegates from across the states sat down to fix the articles, ultimately coming up with an entirely new governing document, the Constitution. And you know, of course, from there that there'll be arguments between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And we'll be talking about the first, on Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll be talking about the first decade of governing. And it's really in the Federalist mode, and that comes to largely shape the government of the Republic and the way the Republic is going to be run. But notice here, just one thing I want to add. You don't want to just, for example, Shays' Rebellion, you don't want to just talk about or mention Shays' Rebellion and then not link it. See here, it links what was significant about it. It revealed the government's total inability to deal with disorders. In other words, we're going to need a stronger government, and that's implied there. Well, that is more than long enough. I apologize it went on this long, but keep this as a resource, and I'll see you in class this week.